sent 50 slides.
Oh, no.
Been slaving over those.
The 3D animations and everything, yeah.
Is that what you're supposed to do when you're on a panel? Like a presentation time?
So, what's up? It's your boy. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish nations. Welcome to Lighthouse Labs. We got a new person coming in. So Lighthouse Labs is a web dev bootcamp. I'll tell you all about it in a couple minutes, but I wanted to start off by introducing the people who are sitting up here. State your name.
I'm John. I'm a developer now, and I took Lighthouse about a year ago.
Cool.
Cool. Oh boy. I'm Reuben. I'm a front-end developer, CMS developer, work on all sorts of websites for universities and cities, and I work at an agency, so we got lots of clients at Domain 7.
I'm Karl. I've been a developer for a while now, full stack with Microsoft. I'm also a mentor here at Lighthouse Labs.
This is just for the live stream.
Yeah, it's just for the live stream. So there's well, it's not a live stream. It's more like a recording.
Okay.
There's people. We have offices around Canada, and there's people who are interested in watching this. If we find that the microphone just gets annoying, I might just repeat stuff into here. And it's really just a fun kind of thing to hold. It makes you feel official. So welcome. I wanted to give you a rundown of what the heck this event is first. I've got a bit of an agenda. I'm an agenda person. So we did item 1 on the agenda is who are you? Check. For the panelists. Who am I? I am Nima Boscarino. I'm the lead instructor for the Web Bootcamp along with Travis Borsa. Just need to call someone else out. And as part of the Web Bootcamp, what we do is we teach people to become web developers. I started running this thing here, Ethical Tech YVR. It's sort of a pseudo monthly meetup where we get together and discuss various topics. Over the course of the year, we've had, I think, 8 or 9 meetings. They're just kind of open to the community. And what we go over is things like weapons and technology. We went over anthropomorphic technology. We did tech for like non-profit purposes and all kinds of stuff. And it's been a while that I've been thinking that it'd be neat for me to learn more about accessibility in web development. It's one of those things I've heard a lot about this year, and I feel bad, and I feel like I'm not doing my part in learning enough and then passing on that knowledge. So I thought it'd be cool to like get a bunch of people like yourselves who have done this stuff to like propagate this. I wanted to give you a bit of an understanding of like what the point of today's panel is. Some people might wonder why this isn't a workshop on accessibility in web development. By all means, a workshop is a great way for you to like learn how to do particular stuff. The point of today's panel is more to just get access to people who have had to deal with developing accessible websites and get it straight from them about what that process is like. This is less of a learn how to and more of a learn about. I think towards the end we'll talk about what the next steps for like developers who want to implement these practices can be. Right? But I wanted to give you that as a bit of a heads up of how I'm running this. So going into this, we're going to assume that y'all are developers with little or no experience. Unless, and this is your time to give me some audience interaction, can you put up your hand if you're not a developer at all? Excellent. Look at that. Right? So that gives us plenty of like knowledge on how we're going to be spinning this. Right? I'm going to take a very kind of conversational approach to this. As I said, there's points. There's no points. I don't know how to. I didn't think of a gamification protocol for this, but you know, like this is very much open to your experiences. Before we get started, I wanted to go a little bit deeper into what each of your experiences are. So, for example, I'll give you a template. I'm Nima. My experience with web accessibility is absolutely nothing because I've never had to make like WCAG compliant websites before in my life, right? That's who I am, right? Right. What is like your particular, in one sentence or 2 sentences, experience with web accessibility?
Sure. So for the past year, We've completely redone our front-end templates, everything that our end consumers see, to be ADA compliant, from not being ADA compliant at all.
Yeah, in my experience, I touch all sorts of different projects. So I've done accessibility stuff from the point of view of getting an audit that somebody received, and it was like, fix all these things. That's often a great way to learn, because you can just, I don't know, you're told what to fix, as well as doing our own audits, or just as part of our work for universities or cities, just making sure that our work is accessible and meets WCAG AA or single A requirements.
Experience with web accessibility is an ongoing process, specifically with a bigger company like Microsoft. We're always updating and changing what our products are. And at the same time, we also have a dedicated team that's specifically looking for accessibility compliance. So even if we thought we finished one pass, there's always going to be a next pass and the next pass until we stop developing and just not touch the product ever again. Because every time we change something might break. So it's always going to be an ongoing process, but it's not something that is cumbersome. It actually makes you appreciate it a bit more.
Sweet. So we have used the word accessibility a couple times, and since we're going to use the word accessibility a lot going through this, I thought it would also be good for us to sort of give a bit of a definition of what accessibility means. Like, what is accessibility, right? And as we're thinking about that, maybe come up with examples of things that aren't accessible. And specifically what I'm thinking of is accessibility on the web, right? It might be worth thinking about accessibility off the web as well, just to frame your description. But what does accessibility on the web mean? Do any of you want to start with that? Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so accessibility in general, I'll stay focused on the web. I think often the immediate response is like screen readers. That's the sort of accessible audience that you're trying to make your application or website work for. But it's really for like so much. It's for so many other things. There's like color blindness. There's offline, like people who are maybe riding the bus or transit and they're going in and out of reception, making sure your website works for that, or even just slow internet speed. Or somebody who's maybe riding on the bus and they're carrying a big bag of groceries, or a kid in the other arm and they can only hold their phone with one hand or something, making sure that your application still works in that case.
In a sense, accessibility is a way for anyone to be able to use your product, website, or anything freely, and also be able to get the core concept of what you're trying to convey to them without having to like figure it out themselves. Like, that's why we have area labels to describe something more specifically, stuff like that.
John, do you have anything you want?
I think they said it perfectly.
Cool. Just on that, one of the things we're going to do is we're just going to continue taking breaks for questions. Does anyone have any questions about any of those descriptions or any of the backgrounds of our panelists? Yeah.
There were a few abbreviations that were thrown out.
Mm-hmm.
One is ADA. Yeah, ADA.
Yep.
One was started with a W.
Mm-hmm.
What were those ones?
Yeah.
Maybe just what the longer versions of those were.
The ADA is the American Disabilities Act. So it's a set of guidelines and compliance rules that one would have to be ADA compliant. You would have to abide by. And
then I think WCAG was the other one, WCAG. WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's a big old document. I think they released a new version recently, like 2 years ago. Yeah, yeah. No, it wasn't like last week, but more like WCAG 2 was years ago, and then WCAG 2.1 was just last year. Yeah, and then there was one last one that Karl mentioned, which is ARIA, which I think we're gonna like ARIA, which we're gonna dive into a bit towards the end. But we'll say for now that it's a special way of labeling the code that you write to make like third kind of systems be able to read or interpret what you've written. So I wanted to ask a little bit like more specifically in terms of say we're talking about ADA, right? What are the things that because Reuben's answer here was like kind of really broad, right? We saw that accessibility doesn't just mean screen readers. Accessibility doesn't even just mean like disabilities, right? It can mean like just access to the website and access to the content. I wanted to ask about ADA wise, like what are the things that like your team had to kind of think about?
So we were primarily focused on people with disabilities. You know, ensuring that your web app or whatever is accessible. You know, if somebody's holding a bag of groceries or things like that is important. But our main focus was sort of letting people. We are an e-commerce platform that helps people buy wine online, and so our main focus was ensuring that we can get as many customers as possible. Ultimately, that's the end goal, to be able to buy wine online, right? So to be ADA compliant for us, the main focus was what Reuben mentioned with screen readers, colorblindness, making sure our contrast on our fonts and backgrounds was high enough, so that yeah, it was primarily focused with people with disabilities.
Oh, do you have something you want?
Oh, sorry. I could answer like WCAG stuff.
Oh, sure.
Well, I feel like it's similar.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe other things we might check are in our work. Like, I think the obvious one that everyone knows is like image alt tags, alt text. Your images have to have that. But really, you got to do quite a lot more. Color contrast is a good one. But actually, just being able to navigate the site with a keyboard and with a screen reader is really important. And I think we can add all the ARIA labels and the accessibility tags and try to get it right. But if you're not actually testing it with a screen reader yourself, you actually won't really make it accessible. And I'd almost compare it to when you're doing your work and you develop your website, you wouldn't just ship it out without testing it with a mouse or with your trackpad or maybe on your mobile device. So if you really want to get accessibility right, you got to be testing your work with an actual screen reader and kind of getting a feel for how it works. And you'll start to get a sense of what doesn't work and like what things are weird. And it'll, in the same way that like if you notice something was weird with a mouse, you'll notice if it's weird with a screen reader, you can start looking at how you actually get it to say the right thing or not do the wrong thing or sort of thing.
I mean, we may as well even ditch the microphone. Did
I'm fine with it.
you're fine with it, Karl? How do you feel about it? Cool. Okay. Well, we'll keep using it. Yeah, it is for the video. You want to wave? So I do have some questions as we're diving into WCAG and into ADA a bit more. I had questions about like how those standards work in terms of like, these may sound like silly questions, but like how does somebody know that they've hit like WCAG compliance or ADA compliance? Like what does the process for that look like? On top of that, and this is sort of like maybe a secondary question, but how do I know when I need to do that? I don't know if that's too big, but does anyone want to start with that?
So for us, we have 2,200 clients across the United States, and a few of their sites were being audited by a company called A360, and they were found to be non-compliant. So we worked together with A360. We had a couple of rounds of QA with them. I think we got, based on our contract, I think 5 rounds of QA, where they would give us, they went through our entire templates, one of our templates, went through it, found, 1,000 or so issues, and then gave us a list of every single issue and how to go about fixing that. And then over a couple of sprints, we tackled those issues and kept pushing our changes to them. And we would have our own QA, like Reuben mentioned. You have to test it yourself. And then they had a team over there, which would QA our work and either give us a stamp of approval or not. And eventually, over the course of, I think, 8 months, we became fully ADA compliant.
I actually do have a real quick follow-up question to that. So you said that the way your company got involved in doing this, or like the way it entered kind of the workflow, is that an external company reached out to let you know that you were non-compliant. So A360?
Yes.
Right. So like nobody from your company had asked A360 to do these
No.
initial kind of runs.
I think a lot of, I mean, it's a recent trend to be compliant. I think it's a good trend. I don't think, 10 years ago or so, I don't think that half the websites would have been compliant as they are today. And I think that, during the process, I think A360, part of their job is going around and auditing different websites and letting people know that they're not compliant. And if they're not compliant, that will be an issue for them in the future.
Thanks.
The only thing I might add is like I feel like it's actually really hard to read the WCAG and like the guidelines, and I'm guessing ADA is probably similar. It's really hard to read them and know exactly what to do because they kind of give you really some vague requirements. They don't tell you need to use this attribute. You need to use if you want to do a modal, it has to use this library. They don't tell you that. They say they give you kind of some rough rules about what it should and shouldn't do, and it's kind of up to you to make sure you meet that. So not really giving you the best answer other than like it's actually pretty hard to that might not be the best spot to go to right away to learn about accessibility.
Karl, do you have anything you want to?
Sure. Yeah. So just to double down on what Reuben said, the way we fix accessibility issues are more or less like hopefully this is the right way we're doing it, because there is a lot of like uncertainties when it comes to like what things you need to use to make it work. There's also a lot of like personal QA that QAs do. Like sometimes they feel like this description is not enough to be compliant. So we also have to deal with like people, right? Like the QA might say, oh, this is not enough, you're missing this, or this color for me is difficult, even though it does satisfy the contrast. So it's always a bit of a battle back and forth to see if what we're doing is complete, or at least close to complete.
Oh man, I actually had a follow-up question for Karl. So Karl, you were telling me earlier that one of the interesting things about the way it works for you, like unlike with John, your company was working with A360 and the back and forth was going there. I haven't asked you yet, Reuben, but with Karl, like there's an internal company at Microsoft that handles the accessibility QA, correct? And do you want to tell us a little bit about how that process works? Like, what does the liaising between maybe the various dev teams and the accessibility QA team kind of look like?
Just to preface this, I can't say that this is the same for all the dev teams that there are in Microsoft, but at least in our team is every sprint, the senior producer would send out like a good to go pass through our website and give us like whatever issues that you find through a ticketing system. And then it's not going to be a process that's going to end. They'll always find something. So basically, it's just going to be a back and forth. After a sprint, send off, receive more stuff. Sprint, send off, receive more stuff. And hopefully, after a sprint, we won't receive anything. And obviously, after a new feature comes out, a new set of accessibility issues will come out. So it's going to be a back and forth. It's not like maybe with A360, they did an audit and then you're done. Ours is more a continuous process.
Just while it's there, this like the team that handles that, would you say like it's a largely like technical team?
I can guarantee that it's not technical team. There's the way they do bugs are very layman's term. Like this is the issue, and then this is what we hope the fix is, and then hopefully we could do it. They don't say you do it like this, you do it like that. We have to figure out what the correct answer is.
I guess one of the things that I'm taking from all three of these is that it kind of feels like there's another stakeholder in this conversation. That does it ever feel like, I mean, I guess in your case with your company, like the accessibility requirements were not necessarily reactionary, but they came as like a secondary thing because of it was necessary to comply with stuff. One of the things I find interesting about Domain 7 in the reading that I've done is that like it's very integral to like the way that you take on projects. Do you want to take us through, because you've described how like Domain 7 does projects for universities. I think you've also done stuff for a bunch of other organizations. What does that process look like for when accessibility guidelines, I don't know if this is the case, but if they're different according to the different stakeholders who are asking for projects?
I'll see. I'd say in general, most of the projects and clients that we're working with are, it's always kind of the same standard that they're required or asking to meet. So we're not running into like, oh, this client needs way more accessibility than another client. But I think because of the types of clients that we work with, and that it's often like it's part of the conversation with them. So we're not talking about like, let's design this really flashy website, and then at the end, let's make it accessible. It's very much from the start of the project, we're talking with them about how, about accessibility being kind of core to the delivery of the project. And so when they're reviewing designs or that sort of thing, and we talk about certain features or compromises that we might be making, they totally get it and they're part of the conversation. So in that way, just working with those types of clients, it's great. It's also great working with just with the dev team, keep making sure it's always part of the conversation. So when we're talking about maybe a new tool for modals or for slideshows, it's often just part of the criteria to, well, is that library accessible, or is it, we don't want to start picking libraries because, well, that's the new hot thing, and then realizing later on that, we have to swap it out because it's not accessible. And then even in code review, as we're reviewing people's work, if they're writing some custom JavaScript interaction or something like that, getting the feedback right away from your colleagues to make sure your work is accessible, and then also just kind of sharing the learning. So I might write some JavaScript and send it out for review, and I might think it's good, but my colleagues might give me some input based on maybe their experience. They did something similar and it didn't work, or something like that. I don't know if I answered the question.
Oh, no, that absolutely did. That actually takes us into the next little part of this, sort of. There was, yeah. Actually, are there any questions at the moment? Yes.
I'm just curious how much time and money is involved in adding this extra. Not that it's not necessary, but just to have some idea of budgeting. What do you percentage of your time is spent doing this?
Do you want to take?
You probably might have different answers. I don't know.
John, do you have an answer?
Sure, yeah. So, like I said before, we have a couple of templates. So essentially, when a user signs up for our site, they can choose any of the templates and then base their custom website on that template. We took all of the changes and we used all the changes required by us that we got back from A360, and we made changes to one template. They QA'd that template, and then we made the changes across the board once they'd approved. The whole process took about 8 months with 3 developers working, 5 days a week. Primarily, 80% of their sprint, their goals for the week was taken up by A360 tickets.
So this is a significant part of your budget planning.
Yeah, took a really long time.
I'll try to give a bit more of an optimistic answer. I would almost compare it to automated testing. So if you're maybe working on your project and you have no automated testing experience, and somebody at the end of the project says, "Hey, we need to have full test suite coverage, and we want to make sure when we push some changes that everything's tested and covered and nothing's going to break." If you're kind of doing that after the fact, it's going to take up a lot of your time. If somebody comes in and says, well, you have no test coverage, you need 100% coverage. Whereas if it kind of becomes more of your day-to-day and it's actually just part of your work, and you write tests when you're working on the feature, it kind of is just part of your work and might even make it faster. I don't know if I wouldn't say doing the accessibility work as part of your work is going to make you faster in the same way testing might. But if you're just doing it as part of your work, it becomes kind of natural and it's part of the review and part of the QA. I think there's always going to be that sort of review at the end and sort of bug fixing back and forth phase that's going to take a certain amount of budget or time. That's just the nature of like any sort of QA. So you can spend as much as you want on QA in general to get the level of quality that you want.
So for our team, right now I'm the only one doing the accessibility bugs, but in general, it doesn't really take much of our time, mainly because we're building it with accessibility in mind already. So whatever bugs we do get are more like the more finicky ones, the more very specific issues. So it as you get used to what Reuben says, you get used to it. It becomes like you're riding a bike. Once you do this pattern, you know that you need to do these labels or these structure to make it compliant. Yeah, pretty much.
Fun fact, as I was researching for your question. Yeah.
I'm curious about how we all source bugs and sort of like where you find that data input in terms of like identifying opportunities of accessibility, and then also if you're seeing like future trends in terms of what companies are trying to make more accessible about their products.
Do anybody want to take that first?
So I think I mentioned that we worked with a company that went through our template. They found all the bugs. They told us, here's the list of 1,000. Go do it. And we would do it, and then we'd give it back. And then ultimately our bugs, or fixing certain bugs would create more bugs in terms of accessibility, and it'd be a back and forth. And then, the second part of your question, sorry, what was that?
Sort of like, do you see a trend in terms of what companies are focusing on in terms of accessibility?
Right. I've noticed, ever since I started on this whole process with my company, I've noticed just through using developer tools, going through Angular, the new version of Angular has built-in accessibility options for you. So I've noticed that in the past couple of years, things have definitely just skyrocketed. It's a trend for sure, but it's one that needs to happen.
What was the first question again? Tools. What do you use? So things that I use, and there's probably a lot of other good ones. But my go-to, there's a company called Site Improve that it's a paid tool, and it's kind of pricey. But for the level of the clients that we're working with, like a city or a university, they have the money for it. It's an auditing tool that does accessibility is just one feature of it, but it'll do things like spell checking and broken links across your whole site and kind of give you a health check. I really like their accessibility audit feedback. It gives you it gives you kind of the automated crawler perspective, and it'll give you a report on the things that it's finding, whether it's a level A thing, double A, and they also have a Chrome extension. So the nice thing about the Chrome extension is that's free. You don't have to pay for the big service, but it's on a per page. Like you can only do it on one page. So, but that's great if you're just, clicking around and working on a feature and you want to test that thing, you just click the button and it'll run the report. I haven't used the Chrome Lighthouse extension much, but I've heard good things about it. I would probably recommend it and try it out more. And then I said earlier, screen reader, I'll just keep tooting my horn. So I personally will test out with VoiceOver with Mac. Every Mac has it. You can enable it pretty quickly, but there's a few other ones that I haven't tested, but I really want to. On Windows, there's a paid accessible or a screen reader called JAWS, which is, I think actually, if you look at the stats of which screen readers are popular, JAWS is probably the most popular one. I believe it's slowly trending down, and there's another one called NVDA that's open source and free that is also on Windows that I haven't tested out, but I would recommend trying it out.
So the tools that we've used is actually I think it's Pally or Pally. It's PA11Y. So basically, it's a very good tool that you can integrate into your pipeline, because it has similar to Lighthouse, where it scans your code and reports. You can have it built in as a command line. So when you run your pipeline, it'll give you a little report of what's missing. This one doesn't have an alt tag, stuff like that. And yes, screen readers, and I have used NVDA. It is really good. I haven't delved deep into it because there's a lot of shortcuts that I can't remember all of them. But it is, I think, a little bit better than Narrator, which is the Windows one, and then TalkBack for Android. I've also used Voice Assistant for Samsung, but that one's a little bit buggy, so it's not that good. But then you can always install TalkBack on Samsung. Lighthouse, the auditing, I've also used, and it does give you a little overview of what you're missing. It's not going to give you anything that's too deep, but it'll give you an overview of this color isn't contrasty enough against this background, right? Just a overview so you can fix it real quick, and then you can always run it anytime you want. What other ones I've also used? I think it's WAME. It's it's from a website called Web Accessibility in Mind. It's free. It basically puts a little map of your headers. It gives you this could be an issue type of a scenario. So basically there's a lot of things you can use. Just depends on what your use cases are.
How about how user feedback integrates?
User feedback is we do have some separate people that do user research, just because we have the resources to do it. And then from them, we build on the challenges that they face with our product, or what we need to change because this is what we're seeing with the telemetry that we have.
There was a question over there.
Yeah. I'll try to make this question technical, not I'm just going to try framing it. So you kind of talked about the e-commerce piece. You kind of talked about the CMS piece, and we know that we've got different stakeholders who kind of come on the website, and everything now is going to go on. In fact, it's going towards mass personalization. So how does the accessibility piece kind of play into that, and what are the tools that you're using to deploy for a QA testing piece of that? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the question.
I don't know if I can speak to the second part of that question, the QA part, but I can, in terms of personalization, our templates, our clients take them and they customize them, and then we have to make sure that the customizations that our clients do are also accessible. And so that was essentially the hardest part of our jobs, because we have, like I said, 2,200 clients. We have to either sort of limit their options, which is not something we want to do, or we have to find some way of making sure that the options that they choose, they're aware that should they choose this option over this option, maybe they won't be accessible. And then making sure that they're aware of that, that is the most we can do as the provider, for, the template provider. And then it's up to them whether or not they want to, you know, shift their rating of their site from a, you know, AAA or AA compliance. The customizations was probably finding different ways to make sure that they are still able to do all the customizations that they want, but still trying to make them compliant was the hardest part.
Did either of you have something you want to?
I'll just say we run into the same the issue that you're talking about. Maybe not quite personalization, but more from the perspective of if we're building a CMS, that means users are, so content management system, users are creating content in the system, which means you don't have full control over that. So we try to build things out in a component architecture. So, you know, we build a slideshow widget or an accordion widget, and they can add that to the page. And we try to make sure that, you know, they don't have to worry about most of the accessibility stuff in like as much as we can. But when we get down to like just a what you see is what you get editor, and they're clicking around and adding things, it's kind of like you don't have full control over that. That's where something like, if they have some sort of audit tool like Site Improve, I'm not a Site Improve salesperson, just for the record, but if there's probably other tools like that, that's where you can kind of catch those issues. And then it might be something that we as developers can, you know, try to mitigate. You know, well, when they do this certain pattern, that's creating multiple IDs, so ID attributes in your markup with the same ID, and that's kind of coming back as a report. Then we can try to see what we can do to help fix that in whatever way we can. But sometimes at the end of the day, it's, you know, the user didn't enter the content correctly, and it might become more of a training thing to make sure the content editors know how to make their content accessible.
You stole my question. The tooling. No, that's honestly that's really interesting to hear. I'd heard about Lighthouse and I played around with it a little bit. Lighthouse is pretty interesting because I think just like Site Improve doesn't just do accessibility, but performance and SEO and a bunch of other stuff. What's really interesting about Lighthouse is that it's built into Chrome now. So if you want to, like, you can right click on your like on a page and go to audits, and then you click start, and it gives you a score on a bunch of stuff. And it's pretty neat because like Karl said, it gives you some actionable stuff, such as like, oh, the colors here are not great, or like all that. So it's pretty interesting. It's like neat that you don't have to shell out money to buy into learning about accessibility and starting to like include that in there. And actually that's kind of my next question is, let's say that I'm a new developer, or even if I'm not a new developer, like maybe even an experienced developer, I'm working on my own projects, right? This is gonna be a two-parter, but like, where can I start with integrating accessibility into my workflow, right? And sort of as an extension, right? If I work at a company that does not currently integrate any accessibility practices, where would you recommend a developer or a non-developer, like a non-technical person in a company, could start? I know that's a pretty big question, but do any of you want to take that on first?
I'll try. Sure. Yeah, I feel like I might be saying the same thing, but I would almost say if you're working on a project and you haven't, you know, accessibility isn't part of your culture at your company, and you want to kind of just get more involved and you want to learn more about it. I feel like the best thing to do is just to actually try to use your product or your application with some of these tools. So try to actually navigate the site with a screen reader, or try to actually learn how a user uses a screen reader. So it can be a little scary turning on VoiceOver on your Mac or something, and all of a sudden you're like, it's just babbling at you and you have no idea how to control it. But you could imagine if you like turned on a computer for the first time, you'd almost have the same experience. So you kind of need to do a bit of learning on how the screen reader works, and then actually test out your work. And I don't know if this works at people's the companies you're at, but you could just start like talking to your coworkers about, hey, check this out. I tried out this page and look how funny this this works or doesn't work. Telling people like, oh look, I'm trying to tab through something and I got stuck here. What might we do to fix it so we don't get stuck there?
Yeah, so I don't know if it works in most companies, but it's the same. It's basically what happened to me before I went to Microsoft. The app that we were making was blatantly like not accessible at all. So as a developer, the most of the what you can do is to one, talk to the higher ups, and two is to like champion accessibility if that's what you want to champion in your company. Like they're not gonna fire you just because you want to put accessibility in. In fact, that's a good thing. So once you start championing it, like you don't have to like push people, step on other people's toes, but like continually putting in like the reasons why accessibility is important. As a young developer, they're a bit, at least in the company that I was at, was a bit more open, especially to junior developers, because they're more excited about new technology and in this case, accessibility. Yeah, so just champion it. Don't be afraid. Just do it. There's nothing wrong with it.
John, do you have
I think Reuben mentioned this earlier, but once you have a little bit of knowledge about it, making sure that it's a continuing sort of culture at the company through code reviews and things like that. So now, my team and I have all gone through this, and we are, we have new features that we put out. We have new stuff that we've been doing since, and every time we do a code review, one of the first things we check for is, hey, does that input have the right ARIA labels? Does is that modal properly labeled? Using a screen reader, does that, if we're sharing a modal that has, both login and forget password, for example, like the login screen, but also the forget password and subs out based on the click, does the title of that modal work for both those situations? So we had a platform that was a couple years old when we started this process. It was 10 years old. And so a lot of our stuff, we took, it wasn't shortcuts, it was efficiency back then, right? Where we share a modal based and swap out contents based on a click. But as opposed to making a whole new modal for that, we just made sure that the title of the modal in terms of ARIA labels works for both. So we called it like a credentials modal. And that way a screen reader will be able to pick that up. They know the situation.
Awesome. Sweet. Are there any? Oh yeah, KV.
You talked about tooling earlier. I was wondering if there's any like accessibility tooling that you guys are plugging into your development, like automated testing cycle. So I guess continuous integration, where like you're checking in code and it's actually similar to linting, kind of saying, oh, like it's actually gotten better or worse or something like that. It gives you a report, so it's easier to kind of remember to make it part of your culture versus doing it manually every time. Like if there's any automation involved there.
Yep.
As I mentioned it before, it's Pali or Pali, so that you can actually integrate that into your pipeline. So regardless of what CI you're using or whatever environment you're using, it's just a command line tool that would scan your code and give you like a report of what it is. I believe it also renders it because it gives us the actual it's pretty much like a test, like automated test, but specifically for accessibility gotchas.
Sweet. As well, I'm taking notes of all of the various like suites of software that y'all have mentioned, and I have a whole kind of list of resources. I wanted to shout out. There's a website called the Accessibility Project, or A11Y project. So A11Y would be the numeronym for accessibility. Usually, if you're trying to learn about accessibility, what you can do is you can go on Twitter, just look up A11Y as a hashtag, and you'll find tons of really like interesting stuff. If you look up awesome A11Y on the internet, you'll find great like lists of resources. But the A11Y project has a whole list of podcasts and tools that you can use. So I will be like linking that. I do have one kind of last question to end this off, and this is around an education piece. So I'm pretty interested in hearing like to tie it back to like why I'm running these meetups in the first place is that like going through a computer science degree, yeah, it's barely there.
Like I kind of just finished.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is like beyond adding like
Mhm.
tags to images, which like 90% of the time you give like the most generic description. You're
Mhm.
like, I know this isn't really a picture,
Yeah.
but like that's like
Actually, I find that really interesting. The alt text, just to take a detour, notice that like since there's AI systems now that can like describe images, I've started finding that popping up in different places. Oh snap! Do I have two questions? Maybe I've got one and then a follow up if you want. But the first question was going to be around the fact that like I found that going through computer science and really just going through tech, like there isn't a ton of emphasis on ethics and a ton of emphasis on empathy. It's just like get it done. Does it make money? Nice, right? Like, you crypto, bro? Like that's just a lot of that. And it would be, I thought it would just be cool to integrate more of the empathy and ethics and like human aspects of the computer world and just our society into tech education. So I was just curious to hear what your thoughts are on integrating accessibility into web dev education, right? Or even broader, just kind of dev education. Do y'all have any thoughts on that, or what you would imagine that would look like in a perfect world? Yeah.
So at least in my experience, well, not my experience, like the hopeful is to have it separate. It's similar to like learning a different coding language. You don't have to be in school to learn it, but you just need to learn the basics of it. So you might know how to make a website, but if you have a separate course or class that deals specifically with understanding what other people needs on a case by case basis, like a website, a phone, or like stairs, like they're all different, but the idea stays the same. Like it has to be able to be usable. So having like I guess like an empathy class is what it is, but specifically for tech, it's gonna be like a good separation between the two. Once you understand how difficult it is to sometimes navigate just to a simple link from even if you're starting from the header, sometimes you can't even get the next link. Then you'll understand that maybe I should start learning learning how to fix these issues or help people get to the one link that's probably the only link in your website. You can always learn that online, so I don't think it's necessary to have a course on it, but to have a course on understanding I think is more important.
Yeah, I have no idea what is being taught from accessibility. I chatted with a few people at work today about that had gone to some code schools, and it was kind of like, oh yeah, at the end there was one day on accessibility that we kind of just ran through it, which I feel like you're not going to get too far with one day. I like the idea of having like this like dedicated empathy thing that you would learn a bit more how to use the tools that we're building. I think the only thing I might stress is just making sure that instructors are aware of accessibility best practices and more from just for the sake of making sure we're not teaching new developers bad habits. I feel like when JavaScript frameworks came out, it was really, it kind of drew a whole bunch of different developers to the front end dev world, and maybe people who hadn't worked in browsers and they didn't really have any sort of experience in accessibility. So, you know, we needed a fancy looking checkbox. So, and it didn't look like your browser checkbox. So we put a bunch of divs together and made it so you can click them. But then those things weren't accessible at all. Or we wanted a fancy drop down, or we wanted a fancy drop down navigation or something. And I think it can be very easy to build those in a non-accessible way, but it can also be really easy to build them in an accessible way and without needing to know like every single ARIA attribute and that sort of thing. So I think if instructors are able to make sure people are learning or teaching things in a like sort of best practice way without needing to say it is accessibility, because it's just, you know, this is just the best practice way to build something.
I think the others said it really well. I just want to add on that frameworks like Angular, which are now, they have built-in options and things like that. Like, everyone wants you to be accessible. The only person who's making your job harder, or the company or the website not accessible, is the developer who's not using the tools or who doesn't know enough. So yeah, you can go online. Like the Mozilla documents have really great resources pertaining to accessibility. And then sort of part of the culture. We at work have a card game. It's a card game for kids called Queue Up. And it's all about teaching empathy. It puts yourself, you put forward a situation, and then you write down who cares about that situation and who would be affected by that situation, and why do we care that they care. And occasionally we play that game at lunch, and I think it's meant for like 6th graders, but it's a really powerful tool, and it really helps us kind of reaffirm our stance on, are we doing the right thing?
Excellent. So are there any questions before we wrap this up? Yep.
This is for all of you. Have you ever had any experience or user test whatsoever with someone with accessibility issues that made you change your product? Or was it always regarding like rules and like web standards?
This isn't actually for web, but it's similar. So there's a case, at least when Gears 5 started development. There's like a chat, there's voice communication over the game. There was a lot of people pushing back because there is a law, I think in the EU, that if you are gonna have a way to communicate between people over the internet or through a game, that it has to be accessible. So initially they started with like, just a regular voice chat. But in the end they added text to speech and speech to text as well as part of the features. So everything changed when that necessity became like a way to like allow more people in to the game.
I don't know if this is answering your question, but kind of maybe. Recently there was a big lawsuit with Domino's where they were getting sued that because people weren't able to essentially order pizza on their website. I don't know what the current where that lawsuit's at, but it kind of I feel like it may have created a bit of panic for all these other restaurants, which maybe have ordering systems online, and that meant all of a sudden we might be working with a restaurant and trying to help them prevent any sort of accessibility legal backlash or something from their website.
I think a couple of our templates got audited down in the States. No lawsuits ensued. but we were sort of warned in that, like if we weren't going to be compliant, then it wouldn't look good for us. So that's the extent of it.
Yeah. So I think we're just about the time, and I think there's some other events that y'all are probably running off to, so I don't want to keep you too long. I did want to thank John, Reuben, and Karl for coming today. So big round of applause. Yep. Points. You all get to touch the internet. Yeah, I will bless you with the internet. There you go. It's quite a bit lighter. Yeah, it's the cloud. So I will be posting information from just all the notes that I've taken and information about John, Reuben, and Karl online. We do have a website for the meetup. It is called ethical YVR.tech. So don't be spooked off by the terrible looking website. This is where I post my my lecture notes, or not lecture notes, but like meeting notes. And boop. That's where you will find the, oh wow, apparently not. That's where you will find information. Probably not tomorrow, but very soon. I'll just be compiling notes as well as shouting out John, Reuben, and Karl. Thanks to all for coming. Is there anything that y'all want to shill real quick? You got a mixtape? Yeah. John DMs for Dungeons and Dragons sometime, so hit him up. He didn't ask for that, but Karl, do you have anything you want to show?
Play Gears of War 5. It's one of I think it's the only game that has scored 6 for 6 for deaf players. So a fully deaf player can play it.
Reuben, do you have
No, I got
shout out to Grammarly. They got a new product coming out soon. Yeah, so thanks. I will be hanging around here. I don't know if y'all are dipping out, but feel free to linger for a little while. Have fun at the rest of Vancouver Startup Week. And cheers. Take care, everyone. Bye.